I am not cattle to be inspected. I am a human being.
She was slapped by a drunken outlaw at auction until the silent rancher delivered ruthless justice. In the scorching dust of Tombstone's auction yard, a drunken outlaw's hand would crack across an innocent woman's face with such brutal force that it silenced an entire crowd of hardened frontier folk. What happened next would become the stuff of legend when a lone cowboy emerged from the shadows to deliver justice so swift and merciless that witnesses would speak of it in hushed whispers for generations. Tombstone, Arizona Territory, had seen better days. Once a booming silver mining town where fortunes were made and lost faster than a gunslinger could draw, it had devolved into something uglier by the summer of 1887. The mines were playing out. Decent folk were moving on, and what remained was a collection of desperados, gamblers, and broken dreams, clinging to a town that no longer deserved its reputation. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street, where storefronts stood like tombstones themselves, many boarded up and abandoned. The Lucky Strike saloon still drew crowds, but they were the wrong kind of crowds. Men who'd rather drink away their failures than work for their next meal. Women who'd lost their way so completely that survival meant sacrificing dignity one coin at a time. At the far end of Main Street, where the town's respectability went to die, stood Jeremiah Pike's auction yard. Pike was a man who'd found profit in other people's misery, a vulture who circled the desperate and picked their bones clean. His weekly auctions drew the worst elements from 3 counties, men looking to acquire what they couldn't earn through honest work. The yard itself was nothing more than a collection of weathered wooden pens surrounded by rough-hewn benches where bidders sat like buzzards waiting for carrion. A raised platform dominated the center where Pike would display his merchandise with the enthusiasm of a man who'd long ago sold his soul and forgotten the price he'd paid for it. This particular Thursday morning, the crowd was larger than usual. Word had spread through the territory's network of saloons and gambling halls that Pike had acquired something special, something that would draw bidders from as far away as Tucson and Phoenix. The air crackled with anticipation and the kind of ugly excitement that comes when desperate men sense an opportunity to claim something beautiful. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. From the ridge overlooking Tombstone, Caleb Hawkwood watched the town's morning ritual unfold with the patient intensity of a predator studying prey. The former Union Army cavalrymen had been hunting the Crimson Vipers, who'd been terrorizing settlements along the border for 3 months, following a trail of blood and broken families that led inevitably to places like Pike's auction yard. Caleb was a man caught between 2 worlds, equally at home in both, yet fully accepted by neither. Born and raised on a quiet farm in Virginia, he'd joined the Union Army not out of loyalty to the North, but out of a desperate need to find meaning in a country tearing itself apart. He'd seen enough of what civilization brought to the frontier. The casual cruelty, the assumption that might made right, the way powerful men used law and order as weapons against the weak. He'd chosen his own path, becoming a solitary hunter and scout who worked for those who couldn't afford justice through official channels. His appearance was striking in a way that made most men uncomfortable. Tall and lean, with the kind of muscular build that came from years of hard living in harsh country, Caleb moved with the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable on foot or horseback. His brown hair hung to his shoulders, and a thick beard covered his angular features. He wore a mixture of cavalry gear and buckskin clothing, a worn blue Union jacket, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his tired eyes. 2 Colt .45 rode low on his hips, but it was the large Bowie knife on his left side that most people noticed first. The blade had been forged by his father from a piece of his grandfather's plow, and it had tasted the blood of more than a dozen men who'd mistaken Caleb's silence for weakness. Now, as he studied the crowd gathering in Pike's auction yard through field glasses, Caleb felt the familiar cold fury that preceded violence. He tracked the Crimson Vipers this far, following reports of kidnapped women and children sold into slavery. Today's auction would determine whether his hunt ended in justice or massacre. The young Apache warrior, named Sierra by her people, had been having the same nightmare for 6 days now, except she was awake, and it was real. At 18 years old, she had been traveling with her band on a hunting trip near the border when the Crimson Vipers struck. She had been raised to work hard, to ride with the wind, and to never back down from a fight. Her long black hair, braided with pieces of bone and leather, and her dark, piercing eyes might have made her beautiful, but it was her fierce independence that made her memorable. She'd put up a fierce fight, but the sheer numbers of the Vipers overwhelmed her. She'd watch them kill her companions, watch them chain the survivors like animals. For 6 days, she'd been chained in the back of a supply wagon with 3 other women and 2 terrified children, traveling through country so desolate that escape meant certain death in the desert. The Viper leader, a man they called Broken Horn, had made it clear what fate awaited them at their journey's end. Sierra had tried to keep the other captives' spirits up, sharing what little water they were given, singing softly to comfort the children, whispering plans of escape that they all knew were hopeless. But as the wagon rolled into Tombstone and she saw the auction yard ahead, Sierra felt her courage wavering for the first time since her capture. The other women had fallen into despair days ago. Mrs. Henderson, a minister's wife from Kansas, prayed constantly through cracked lips. Maria Santos, barely 16 and 8 months pregnant, hadn't spoken since watching her husband die. Young Timothy and Sarah Mullins, orphans aged 10 and 12, clung to each other with the desperate intensity of children who'd learned too young that the world was full of monsters. But Sierra refused to surrender. Even as Broken Horn's men dragged them from the wagon and herded them into Pike's holding pen like livestock, even as the crowd of bidders looked them over with eyes that made her skin crawl, Sierra kept her head high and her dark eyes blazing with defiant fury. Bon, vidwat hai. Jeremiah Pike was a showman above all else, understanding that the drama of anticipation increased both attendance and final bids. He strutted onto his platform, wearing his best suit, a garish purple affair that had seen better days, and spread his arms wide to welcome the eager crowd. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," Pike called out, his voice carrying the polish of a man who'd once sold snake oil before discovering more profitable merchandise. "Today we have something special, something that'll make this a day you remember for the rest of your natural lives." The crowd pressed closer to the platform. Sierra counted at least 40 men in the audience, representing every variety of frontier scum. Ranch foremen looking for help that wouldn't demand wages, saloon owners seeking fresh attractions, wealthy Mexican landowners whose haciendas were always in need of servant girls who couldn't complain to authorities. Pike began with the children, knowing that the horror of their situation would inflame the crowd's bloodlust for the main attractions. Timothy and Sarah were sold within minutes to a cattle baron who claimed he needed young hands for light work, but whose reputation suggested otherwise. Sierra watched them disappear into the crowd and felt something die inside her chest. Mrs. Henderson went next, purchased by the owner of a mining camp who promised she'd be properly cared for in a Christian environment. The woman's relief at avoiding a worse fate was heartbreaking to witness. Maria Santos, despite her pregnancy, drew fierce bidding from men who saw her condition as a temporary inconvenience rather than a reason for mercy. Throughout it all, Sierra studied the crowd, looking for any face that showed a hint of decency or compassion. Most of the bidders were exactly what she'd expected. Hard men, worn rough by frontier living, their eyes holding the kind of casual cruelty that came from treating other people as property for too long. But there were others who disturbed her more deeply. Well-dressed men who bid with the calm demeanor of businessmen acquiring inventory. A Mexican don who sat fanning himself beneath a silk parasol while his vaqueros did his bidding. A cavalry officer whose uniform bore the stains of hard campaign, but whose presence at such an auction suggested corruption ran deeper than appearance indicated. As Pike's assistant led Sierra onto the platform, she felt the weight of 40 pairs of eyes evaluating her like livestock. The auctioneer began his practiced spiel, describing her fine breeding and obvious strength, as if these qualities were flaws to be overlooked rather than virtues to be respected. Silas, The butcher Crenshaw had been drinking since dawn, starting with whiskey in his coffee and progressing through half a bottle of rotgut that had burned away what little restraint he possessed to begin with. The outlaw leader commanded a gang of 12 men who specialized in robbing isolated ranches and wayward travelers, but lately their luck had been poor, and their funds even worse. Crenshaw was a big man, gone soft around the middle, with greasy black hair and a beard that hadn't seen soap in weeks. His clothes were expensive but filthy. His guns were well maintained, but his hands shook from too much liquor and too little sleep. He'd ridden into Tombstone hoping to acquire a woman who could cook and clean for his gang's hideout, but seeing Sierra on the platform had awakened darker appetites. "Look at her," Crenshaw slurred to his lieutenant, a scarred killer named Dutch Martinez, "acting all high and mighty like she's too good for honest men like us. Someone needs to teach her some manners." The bidding had started slow but was gaining momentum. Sierra stood with her back straight on the platform, her chin raised in defiance despite the circumstances. When Pike ordered her to turn around so bidders could evaluate her figure, Sierra refused. When he repeated the command more harshly, Sierra looked him dead in the eye and said in her native tongue, translated perfectly by her proud gaze and fierce stance, "I am not cattle to be inspected. I am a human being, and I will not be treated otherwise." The crowd erupted in a mixture of laughter and catcalls. Some men seemed amused by her spirit, others appeared offended by her defiance. But Silas Crenshaw took her words as a personal insult that demanded immediate correction. "You hear that, boys?" Crenshaw shouted, climbing unsteadily to his feet. "The little squaw thinks she's too good for us common folk. Maybe someone should teach her different." The word squaw carried the weight of 1,000 insults, a term of contempt used to strip Native American women of their dignity, reducing them to property. Pike tried to maintain control of his auction, gesturing for Crenshaw to sit down. "Now, Silas, let's keep things orderly. We got business to conduct here." But Crenshaw was beyond reason, fueled by whiskey and the kind of rage that comes when weak men feel disrespected by those they consider beneath them. He pushed through the crowd toward the platform, his hand resting on his gun butt in a gesture meant to intimidate. "I got $20, says that uppity little squaw. Ain't so proud after I show her what real men expect from their women." Sierra felt fear for the first time since stepping onto the platform, but she didn't let it show. She'd grown up with 3 older brothers who taught her that bullies only respected strength, and backing down from this man would invite worse treatment from everyone else. $20 won't buy you anything from me, except the pleasure of hearing me tell you exactly what kind of man you really are." The crowd went dead silent. Even Pike seemed stunned by Sierra's audacity. In the brutal hierarchy of frontier justice, defying an armed outlaw in front of witnesses was tantamount to suicide. Crenshaw's face turned purple with rage. He lurched up the steps to the platform, his movements clumsy but determined. Sierra stood her ground even as Pike backed away, unwilling to get between an angry drunk and his target. "You need to learn some respect, little girl." Crenshaw came up fast and hard. The sound of his palm striking Sierra's cheek echoed across the auction yard like a gunshot. The blow was vicious enough to snap her head to the side and bring tears to her eyes. But Sierra didn't fall. She turned back to face her attacker, blood trickling from her split lip, her dark eyes blazing with fury rather than fear. "Is that the best you can do?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. For a moment, nobody moved. The crowd seemed frozen between admiration for Sierra's courage and shock at her suicidal defiance. Crenshaw raised his hand to strike again, this time with enough force to knock her unconscious. That's when Caleb Hawkwood stepped out of the crowd. "Still here? Hit the comments with a flood of 1 second, and tell us where you're watching from, if you love Wild West love stories." Vidwan ba. The crowd parted like water before a shark as Caleb moved through the auction yard with predatory grace. His worn boots made no sound on the packed earth, but every man instinctively stepped aside as something primal in their hindbrain recognized the approach of an apex predator. The former cavalryman's dark eyes never left Silas Crenshaw's face as he glided toward the platform, with the fluid motion of smoke given human form. Caleb had been watching from the shadows since dawn, positioned behind the old water trough, where the angle gave him clear sightlines to every corner of Pike's operation. He'd seen enough slave auctions to know how they operated, had witnessed the systematic dehumanization that turned people into property with the scratch of a pen and the exchange of coin. But something about the Apache woman's defiance had stirred memories he'd spent years trying to bury. His own father, Captain William Hawkwood, had possessed that same fierce spirit when he'd tried to defend the Apache from the militia at the Camp Grant massacre in 1871. Caleb had witnessed the atrocity, had seen his father try to intervene and get shot for his troubles. The memory of his father's bleeding body on the ground, surrounded by the corpses of women and children, was a pain that had never healed. It had driven him to leave the cavalry and become a loner. Now, as Caleb stepped into the open space around Pike's platform, 40 pairs of eyes turned to study this new player in their deadly game. What they saw was a man who moved like violence, given form, whose very presence seemed to charge the air with the promise of sudden death. Even the most hardened killers in Pike's crowd felt their hands drift unconsciously toward their weapons. Crenshaw's raised hand froze mid-swing as he became aware of the predatory stillness that had fallen over the auction yard. The drunken outlaw turned to see what had captured everyone's attention and found himself staring into eyes that held all the warmth of a winter storm. Caleb stood 15 feet away, his hands hanging loose at his sides, but every line of his body suggested coiled violence, ready to explode into motion. "Step away from the woman," Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. The words were spoken in perfect English, but with an undertone that suggested speaking at all was a courtesy he rarely extended to men like Crenshaw. Crenshaw's whiskey-soaked brain took several seconds to process this development. A damned cavalryman, by the look of him, was giving orders to a white man in front of witnesses. The racial hierarchy of the frontier demanded a response that would reassert proper dominance, regardless of how dangerous this particular cowboy appeared to be. "You got some stones, soldier," Crenshaw slurred, trying to inject authority into his voice despite the tremor that betrayed his growing fear. "But you're forgetting your place. This here's my business, and you'd best get back to whatever hole you crawled out of before someone teaches you proper manners." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of his stillness. Where before he'd seemed merely dangerous, now he radiated the focused intensity of a diamondback coiled to strike. The crowd sensed the change and began edging backward, creating more space around the platform where violence was about to unfold. Sierra watched this exchange with fascination rather than fear. Her cheeks still burned from Crenshaw's blow, and she could taste blood from her split lip. But the arrival of this silent cowboy had fundamentally altered the dynamics of her situation. She didn't know if he intended to help her or simply eliminate a competitor for her purchase. But either way, he represented change in circumstances that had seemed hopeless. "I'll give you one more chance," Caleb said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Step away from the woman, mount your horse and ride out of town. Do this now and you might live to see another sunset." The crowd stirred uneasily at these words. In the brutal mathematics of frontier justice, threatening a man like Crenshaw, especially in front of witnesses, was a capital offense. But there was something about Caleb's calm certainty that suggested he wasn't making empty threats. This was a man who'd killed before and felt no moral qualms about killing again. Crenshaw's gang began moving through the crowd, hands drifting toward gun butts as they prepared to support their leader. Dutch Martinez positioned himself near the platform's left side, while 2 other outlaws flanked right. The remaining gang members spread out to create crossfire lanes, their movements coordinated with the precision of men who'd fought together many times. But Pike's regular customers were caught in the middle of what was rapidly escalating into a shooting war. The auction crowd began melting away toward the exits as survival instincts overcame curiosity. Within moments, the yard had cleared except for Crenshaw's gang, Pike's hired muscle, and a handful of spectators too drunk or stupid to recognize mortal danger. "You think I'm afraid of one half-breed cowboy?" Crenshaw shouted, drawing confidence from his numerical advantage. "Boys, Show this red devil what happens when his kind gets uppity with white folks." Caleb smiled for the first time since entering the auction yard. It wasn't a pleasant expression, more like a wolf baring its fangs before attacking. His hands remained at his sides, but Sierra noticed his weight had shifted to the balls of his feet in preparation for explosive movement. What happened next would be talked about in tombstone saloons for decades, growing into legend with each retelling until the truth became indistinguishable from myth. Caleb moved with a speed that seemed to bend the laws of physics, his hands flowing to his guns in a draw so smooth it appeared choreographed. The first shot took Dutch Martinez between the eyes before the outlaw could clear leather. The second and third shots, fired so close together they sounded like one, dropped the two flanking gunmen with rounds through their hearts. Caleb was already moving as he fired, rolling left behind a water barrel as return fire began chewing splinters from the platform. Crenshaw had thrown himself flat at the first gunshot, his whiskey-addled reflexes finally serving him well. From his prone position, he had a clear view of Caleb's impossible display of marksmanship and tactical awareness. The former soldier seemed to anticipate where each opponent would be before they got there, placing his shots with surgical precision while avoiding the desperate return fire of increasingly panicked outlaws. Sierra had dropped to the platform's wooden planks the moment shooting started, but she couldn't resist watching the deadly ballet unfolding below. Caleb fought like no man she'd ever seen, combining the fluid grace of his experience with gunfighting skills that would have impressed Wild Bill Hickok. He moved through the auction yard like a ghost, using cover and concealment to separate his enemies and defeat them individually. The fourth outlaw tried to circle around behind the platform and walked into Caleb's knife. The blade took him under the ribs and angled upward into his heart, dropping him without a sound. The fifth and sixth men, rattled by watching their companions die with such casual efficiency, broke and ran for their horses. Caleb let them go, recognizing they no longer posed a threat. Pike's hired muscle, 3 hard cases who'd been paid to maintain order at the auction, found themselves in a situation far beyond their pay grade. They'd signed on to intimidate unruly bidders and prevent escapes, not to face down a one-man war party. When Caleb's cold gaze swept over them, all 3 simultaneously decided they had urgent business elsewhere. Within 90 seconds of the first shot, 7 men were dead or dying, and the auction yard belonged entirely to Caleb. The cowboy reloaded his guns with practiced efficiency, his movements calm and unhurried despite the carnage surrounding him. Gunsmoke drifted across the platform like incense in some deadly cathedral. Crenshaw slowly pushed himself to his knees, his hands raised in surrender, his face pale with shock and terror. The outlaw leader, who'd strutted around the auction yard like a conquering hero, was now reduced to begging for his life from a man he'd dismissed as racially inferior just minutes before. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." "Bissau, Vidwanbun." Caleb holstered his guns and walked slowly toward the platform, where Crenshaw knelt in terrified submission. The cowboy's boots crunched softly on the gravel, scattered with brass cartridge cases and growing pools of blood. His expression remained impassive, but Sierra could see calculation in his dark eyes as he studied the man who'd struck her. "Please," Crenshaw whimpered, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "I got money. Gold hidden away. You can have it all. Just let me live. I got a family back in Missouri. Kids who need their daddy." Caleb stopped directly in front of the platform, close enough that Crenshaw could see his own reflection in the cowboy's obsidian eyes. When Caleb spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute judgment. "You struck a woman who could not defend herself. In my culture, such men are considered less than animals. Animals at least kill for food or to protect their young. You struck her to feed your own weakness." Sierra found herself studying Caleb's profile as he spoke, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his long brown hair caught the afternoon sunlight. There was something almost ritualistic about his stillness, as if he was performing a ceremony that required perfect precision. Among men of honor, Caleb continued. "There are traditions for dealing with men who abuse women and children. These traditions are very old, passed down from our grandfathers' grandfathers. They exist because some lessons can only be learned through pain." Crenshaw's eyes widened with dawning horror as he realized Caleb wasn't interested in negotiating terms of surrender. This wasn't about money or territory or even personal revenge. This was about justice, according to laws far older than any territorial court. Caleb drew his knife, the same blade that had been a part of his father's life, the one that had witnessed the brutal chaos of war and the even more brutal chaos of the frontier. The weapon seemed to absorb sunlight along its keen edge, and Crenshaw could see his own terrified face reflected in the polished steel. "Wait," Sierra called out from the platform, surprising herself by speaking. "What's your name?" Caleb turned to look at her, his knife still pointed at Crenshaw's throat. For a moment their eyes met, and Sierra felt something pass between them, recognition perhaps, or understanding. When he spoke, his voice held a different quality, warmer somehow. "I'm called Caleb among the whites. My family name is Hawkwood." Sierra nodded slowly. "Caleb, this man deserves to die for what he's done. But killing him won't change anything. There will always be another man like him, and another after that. Maybe there's a different kind of justice." Caleb studied her face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the strength that had allowed her to maintain dignity, even in chains. Here was a woman who understood that true strength sometimes meant choosing mercy when vengeance would be easier. "What would you have me do with him?" Sierra looked down at Crenshaw, who knelt trembling in his own filth, stripped of all pretense, and reduced to his essential cowardice. An idea began forming in her mind, shaped by years of her people's teachings on honor and humiliation. "Strip him," Sierra said quietly, her voice carrying across the now silent auction yard. "Take his guns, his money, his boots. Leave him with nothing but his shame and the long walk back to whatever hole he crawled out of." Caleb considered this for a long moment, his knife still pressed against Crenshaw's throat. The cowboy's way would be a swift execution, an ending that balanced the scales of justice with blood. But this Apache woman spoke of a different kind of justice, one that left the guilty alive to carry the weight of their humiliation. "You would show mercy to a man who showed you none?" Caleb asked. Sierra shook her head. "Not mercy, education. Let him walk back to his gang naked and beaten, carrying the story of how one cowboy destroyed 12 men without breaking a sweat. Let every outlaw from here to the Rio Grande know that Caleb Hawkwood is hunting them, and that their lives depend on how they treat the innocent." The wisdom of this approach struck Caleb immediately. A dead outlaw was just another corpse in a territory already littered with them, but a living example of defeat, stripped of dignity and weapons, would spread fear more effectively than any number of graves. Caleb stepped back and sheathed his knife, but his eyes never left Crenshaw's face. "You heard the lady. Remove your clothes, all of them." Crenshaw looked desperately around the auction yard, hoping for a rescue that wasn't coming. Pike had disappeared entirely, along with his remaining employees. The few spectators who'd stayed to watch the gunfight were now backing away, unwilling to become involved in whatever came next. With shaking hands, Crenshaw began removing his clothing. His gun belt fell first, followed by his stained vest and sweat-soaked shirt. His boots came off with difficulty, revealing feet that hadn't seen soap in months. Soon he stood completely naked in the Arizona sun, his pale skin already beginning to burn. Caleb gathered Crenshaw's possessions, noting the outlaw carried nearly $200 in gold and silver, money undoubtedly stolen from honest folks who'd had the misfortune to cross his path. The weapons were well maintained but unremarkable, the kind of guns carried by men who valued intimidation over accuracy. "Start walking," Caleb commanded, pointing toward the desert road that led north out of Tombstone. "Your horse belongs to me now, along with everything else you brought here. If I see you in this territory again, I'll finish what we started today." Crenshaw stumbled toward the road, his naked form already attracting flies in the desert heat. Each step on the rocky ground sent pain shooting through his soft feet, and he could feel his skin beginning to blister under the merciless sun. Behind him, the sound of Caleb's voice carried clearly in the still air. "Tell your friends what happened here. Tell them Caleb Hawkwood is hunting slave traders and the men who buy from them. Tell them the Apache remember every face, every name, every crime." As Crenshaw disappeared into the shimmering heat of the desert road, Caleb turned his attention to the more pressing matter of what to do with Sierra, the woman who'd shown such courage in the face of brutality, who'd chosen mercy when vengeance would have been justified. She represented something Caleb had thought lost in this harsh land, the possibility that civilization might actually mean more than simply the strong preying upon the weak. Caleb approached the platform where Sierra still sat, her wrists raw from the iron shackles that had held her for 6 days of hell. The cowboy moved with the same fluid grace that had carried him through the gunfight, but now his weapons were holstered, and his hands opened in a gesture of peace. When he spoke, his voice held a gentleness that hadn't been there when addressing Crenshaw. "You are free to go, Sierra." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a sacred fire. Sierra stared at this man who'd materialized from nowhere to deliver justice with surgical precision, trying to understand what he expected from her. In her experience, men who performed heroic acts always demanded payment of some kind: gratitude, submission, or services she wasn't willing to provide. "Free to go where?" Sierra asked, climbing carefully to her feet. Her legs trembled from exhaustion and the aftermath of terror, but her voice remained steady. "I have no money, no horse, no supplies. My traveling companions are dead. My belongings burned with the wagons. Freedom without means is just another kind of prison." Caleb studied her face, noting the practical intelligence behind her question. This woman understood that rescue without resources was merely a different form of captivity. She wasn't weeping with gratitude or throwing herself at his feet in feminine helplessness. Instead, she was calculating her options with the cool logic of someone accustomed to solving her own problems. "The outlaw's horse and gear belong to you now," Caleb said, nodding toward Crenshaw's mount, a sturdy bay mare with good lines and better training. "His money, too, by right of conquest. There's enough gold there to buy passage to wherever you were heading." Sierra looked at the horse, then back at Caleb. Something in his manner suggested this conversation was more complex than a simple transfer of property. He was testing her somehow, waiting to see how she'd respond to unexpected freedom. "And what about you?" she asked. "Do you always ride into town, kill half a dozen outlaws, and then disappear back into the desert like some kind of avenging spirit?" For the first time since she'd seen him, Caleb's expression shifted toward something that might have been amusement. "Usually, yes, but today feels different. If you're watching on television, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Baby, vidduatnam." Sierra stepped down from the platform, moving carefully to avoid the pools of blood that marked where Crenshaw's men had fallen. The auction yard looked like a battlefield now, littered with bodies and abandoned weapons. The faint, rhythmic clang of a sheriff's bell began to echo down the street, followed by the thunder of hooves and shouted orders. The law was coming, and they didn't have much time. She understood that staying to explain would only lead to more questions, more legal battles, and more delays. This wasn't a fight they could win in a courtroom. She looked at Caleb and saw the same urgency in his eyes. He wasn't a hero in the eyes of the law, but a man on the run who had to choose his battles wisely. This was a true cowboy story, after all. "There's something you should know," Caleb said, pulling a worn leather portfolio from his saddlebags. Inside were wanted posters, dozens of them, featuring the faces of men involved in the slave trade that stretched from Colorado to Mexico. "I didn't come to Tombstone to rescue you specifically. I came hunting the men who sold you." Sierra examined the posters, recognizing several faces from her nightmare journey. Broken Horn's scarred visage stared back at her from a Dodger, offering $500 for his capture, dead or alive. Other faces belonged to the Crimson Vipers who destroyed her band and murdered her companions. "You're a bounty hunter," Sierra said, understanding flooding her voice. "This wasn't about justice for me. This was about the reward money." Caleb shook his head slowly. "The money matters, but not in the way you think. Every dollar I collect from these bounties goes to buy supplies for Apache families hiding in the mountains, or to purchase the freedom of children sold into slavery. Justice and profit can serve the same cause when the cause is righteous. Sierra studied the wanted posters more carefully, noting the crimes listed beneath each photograph. Murder, kidnapping, slave trading, rape. These men represented the absolute worst of frontier lawlessness. If Caleb was hunting them, he was doing work that territorial marshals either couldn't or wouldn't handle. "The Vipers who took me," Sierra said, "they're part of a larger organization." They talked about other raids, other auctions. There are more victims out there, more families destroyed. "Which is why I'm offering you a choice," Caleb said. "Take Crenshaw's horse and money, ride to the nearest town with a sheriff, and try to rebuild your life, or ride with me and help me find the rest of them." The proposition hit Sierra like a physical blow. She'd spent 6 days dreaming of escape, of returning to some semblance of normal life. The idea of deliberately placing herself in more danger, of tracking down the very men who terrorized her, seemed like madness. But as she looked at the wanted posters, Sierra saw the faces of other victims, women and children whose suffering would continue as long as these predators remained free. She thought of Timothy and Sarah Mullins, the orphan children sold to a cattle baron whose reputation suggested their fate would be worse than death. "Why me?" Sierra asked. "You could track them alone. You've obviously done this kind of work before." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying some distant point beyond the auction yard. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of old pain. "Because you know their faces, their voices, their methods, because you've seen how they operate and survive to tell about it, and because sometimes the hunter needs someone who remembers what it feels like to be prey." Caleb began saddling Crenshaw's horse, his movements efficient and sure. As he worked, he spoke in a voice so quiet Sierra had to move closer to hear him clearly. "My father was a cavalry officer who tried to protect your people at Camp Grant. By the time I found him, he was already dead, and so were the Apache women and children he'd died trying to save. I killed the militia men who murdered him, and I felt nothing but satisfaction. But it didn't bring my father back. Nothing I did could undo what had been done. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments." So I decided that if I couldn't save my father, or the innocent, I could find a different kind of justice. A justice that was born out of sacrifice and honor. Caleb finished adjusting the stirrups and turned to face Sierra directly. In his eyes, she saw not just grief, but a kind of terrible purpose that had been forged in the fires of loss. He was a man who'd found meaning in preventing others from experiencing the loss that had nearly destroyed him. "How many have you saved?" Sierra asked. 43 women and children recovered alive, 67 slavers killed or captured. But there are always more. The trade grows stronger every year, as law enforcement grows weaker. Sierra looked around the blood-soaked auction yard, imagining how many similar scenes had played out across the frontier. How many women had stood where she stood, facing a future of brutalization and despair. How many had died because no one like Caleb had arrived in time. "If I ride with you," Sierra said slowly, "I won't be a burden. I can shoot, I can ride, and I can take care of myself. But I have conditions." Caleb raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her boldness. "Name them." "First, we save whoever we can, not just collect bounties. Second, you teach me everything you know about tracking and fighting. And third, we break this whole network to the ground. We don't just hunt them, we become the law they've been running from." Caleb studied Sierra's face, seeing determination that matched his own. Here was a woman who'd looked into the abyss and decided to stare back. Most people who survived what she'd endured would spend the rest of their lives hiding from shadows. Sierra was proposing to hunt the monsters who cast them. "Mount up," Caleb said, swinging into his own saddle with fluid grace. "We have a trail to follow while it's still warm. The Crimson Vipers are moving south toward the border, but they'll stop at way stations to rest their horses and count their money." Sierra settled into Crenshaw's saddle, surprised by how well the leather fit her frame. The outlaw had possessed good taste in horseflesh and tack, whatever his other failings. The bay mare responded to her touch with the kind of training that suggested regular care and proper handling. As they rode out of Tombstone, Sierra noticed how Caleb seemed to read the landscape like a book written in dust and stone. His eyes constantly moved, cataloging tracks, noting wind patterns, identifying the best routes for both pursuit and escape. This was a man completely at home in